Shalom Hovering, James Trim here, and this is the first in a series of teachings on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to start with the Damascus Document. So this will be part one of the Damascus Document. Now, I've been studying, I'm 56 years old. I've been studying the Dead Sea Scrolls uh, for almost 50 years, since I was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, I went to the Fort Worth Public Library and I checked out a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I found them so fascinating that I went to Walden's bookstore at Northeast Mall and I bought this in 1976, brand new at the time. This is the third revised and enlarged edition English translation of Theodore Gaster's translation. You can still, I think, get this translation in a more up to date version. And then in 1983, while I was in high school, I bought this, which is a second edition of Vermish's translation. Well, I guess a decade later, this edition came out, which is the one I largely use these days because it was highly recommended to me at the time in the 1990s. It was put together by Weiss, Abeck, and Cook, who were at the time friends of a friend of mine. And so it came highly recommended to me, and I started using it as my primary text. But I actually have in my library the actual Hebrew of these documents, and I have photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is volume one. It's a 2-volume set that BAS put out in the 1990s. I think you can get this stuff online now, certainly in some kind of digital format. And then to go with that, this little comb-bound volume that is a catalog of the Dead Sea Scrolls that you can look up Dead Sea Scrolls and it'll tell you what library or museum they're in, what the manuscript number is, but all importantly also what their photograph number is in the 2-volume set that I just mentioned to you. And then one of my colleagues, I think it was Dr. Philip Arnold, sent me this, which is back in the 1990s, which is the radiocarbon dating. It's calibrated radiocarbon dates from Tucson and Zurich on the Dead Sea texts and linen. So this is handy to look up the radiocarbon dates of different scrolls. Okay. Bottom line, I've been studying this stuff for a long time, and people were interested in some good quality teaching on the Dead Sea Scrolls because there's a lot of hokey stuff out there. And for purposes of the study that we'll be doing, the Dead Sea Scrolls were composed by Essenes. I have put together a series, a parallel of quotes from the Dead Sea Scroll documents and quotes from Josephus and Philo of Alexandria about the Essenes. And I've put these in parallel to each other so that anyone who doesn't have an agenda can see that very clearly the Qumran community were Essenes. So there's a lot of hokey theories out there, but they were in fact Essenes. And that is the majority view of scholars, and with good reason. I will put a link in the video description to that blog that I put together that puts all these quotes in parallel, so anybody can see for themselves very clearly who the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Qumran's community, were Essenes. Okay, I hope to bring something new to the table. First of all, quality teaching, because there is a lot of hokey stuff out there, and especially if you go searching on YouTube, you're going to find a lot of that hokey stuff out there. Um, and two, I have something of a knowledge of rabbinic literature, so I bring an understanding of rabbinic Judaism to this study. And I also have a knowledge of the so-called New Testament. I prefer to call it the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, which I think also brings some understanding. Okay, so I'm going to be using this edition primarily. Now, I'm used to using this edition. It's a good text, but there's times that I take exception to the translation that they use, and and I may depart from it that at times. And in our notes, I'll give you some reason for that, and maybe the actual Hebrew for some of the words or something of that nature. Um, like many of my video series, there are PDF notes and a link to that in the comments or in the video description where you can get the PDF notes, and that will help you. Okay, you can use any translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One thing helpful about this edition is that not only we reference the Dead Sea Scrolls not by chapter and verse like we would the Bible, but by column number and by line number. So the scrolls are written in columns on the scroll, and then there are obviously lines. So there's a column first and then a line number. One of the helpful things about the Weiss, Abegg, and Cook edition is that it is divided into both columns and line numbers for easy reference. Unfortunately, some of the editions that are out there are divided only into columns, or maybe they're divided into columns, and then every so often there will be a break that tells you that this upcoming section is lines X through Y, but it's a whole series of lines. It's not just divided, it doesn't have divisions that tell you exactly where the line, chapter and verse, I'm sorry, the column and line numbers uh, differentiate. Also, this edition starts out the Damascus document with an opening portion, because we now know that at least the copies that we had there um, had an opening which is now lost, and 4Q 266 in the Dead Sea Scrolls gives us a couple of gives us a couple of fragments or a fragment of this. Oh, it's actually 4Q 266 and 4Q 268 give us a couple of fragments of this opening text. You can read that by yourself. The worms have eaten so much. A lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls, worms ate a lot of it. Some of the texts we have nice, complete scrolls, the worms didn't get to much of it. And some of them, the worms ate most of it. And in this case, the worms ate most of that. And so there's so many dots and brackets with dots in there that you can't make much heads or tails of it, except I will point out that it does contain the phrase children of light or sons of light, same thing in Hebrew, which is a significant phrase that is used elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what's interesting, this phrase B'nai Or in Hebrew also is a term that the Qumran community used to describe themselves. It's also a term that is used in the so-called New Testament, both in Paul's letters and in the Gospels. Yeshua uses it as a term that the ancient Nazarenes, the original Jewish followers of Yeshua, seem to have used to refer to themselves as the sons of light. Most translations of this document begin where the Weiss, Abegg, and Cook edition starts, where it says A1. A means it's Geniza copy A. and it's line 1 or column 1. So listen, all you who recognize righteousness and consider the deeds of Elohim, of God, when he has, I said Elohim, and I don't have the Hebrew in front of me. I'm just going to say God when this says God. Uh, when he has a dispute with any mortal, he passes judgment on those who spurn him. For when Israel abandoned him by being faithless, he turned away from them and from his sanctuary and gave them up to the sword. So this is apparently referring to the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple around 600 CE. Uh, But when he called to mind the covenant he made with their forefathers, he left a remnant of Israel and did not allow them to be exterminated. In the era of wrath, 390 years at the time, he handed them over to the power of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So let's pause there. So this is one of the more important statements. Um, in understanding some things about the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, the Qumran sect. The sect began 390 years after the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, around 200 CE, 210 BCE, or 210 BCE. To give you a context for that, that's around the time of the events of the book of Third Maccabees. But when the sect began, uh, it only began when they. Well, let's continue. Line 7. He took care of them and caused to grow from Israel and from Aharon a root of planting to inherit his land and to grow fat on the good produce of his soil. They considered their iniquity, and they knew that they were guilty men and had been like the blind and like those groping for the way. Groping for the way 20 years. But God considered their deeds, that they had sought him with a whole heart. Okay, so they separated from the main line of Judaism around 390 years after the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. So around 200 to 210 BCE, they separated from the main line of Judaism. No, they were still Jewish. It was still Judaism, but it was they started another sect, their own sect. They separated themselves from the majority, as 4QMMT I believe says, or maybe it's this document that says that. They separated themselves from the majority. But for 20 years after they separated from the majority, because they realized, they decided that there was an apostasy, uh, uh, what they refer to in this document elsewhere as the era of wickedness, or the Kates uh, um, Harasha, the era of wickedness. They they spent 20 years kind of wondering and not having clarity, if you will, and then a figure arose to lead them in the way. Um, but God considered their deeds, that they had sought him with a whole heart. So he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness, a Moreh Tzaddik. That's a very important phrase that we see throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect founder, and I say founder, but he actually came along 20 years after the fact, at least according to this document, is a figure known only as the Moreh Tzaddik, the teacher of righteousness. And we don't get his name. The scrolls never tell us who he was, what his name was. They simply referred to him as the Morate Zadok. And the Morate Zadok, now, I know there's hokey theories out there, hokey materials out there claiming that the Morate Zadok was James the Just, or the Morate Zadok was Yeshua. And that doesn't appear to be the case for a number of reasons. One of which is that the time period is all wrong. The Damascus document is telling us that if you take that 390 years and you add 20 years to it, then you got 410 years. So 410 years after the Babylonian captivity, that's I say 410. Yeah, that's taking you maybe 180 BCE. It's not taking you anywhere near the time of the life of Yeshua or the time of the life of James the Just. And the radiocarbon dating of the scrolls even has them, many of the important scrolls predating that time. Okay. So the Morate Zadok was leader of the community that arose to prominence and started teaching and impressing this community. Yeah, there are a lot of things that we can speculate, and there's a lot of things that we can consider. Um, according to this scroll, their sect started 390 years after the Babylonian captivity, but 20 years later, this leader arose. Our experience with religious organizations tells us that maybe there were two kinds of Qumran community, a group that followed the Morate Zadok and a group that never did. So these might be two kinds of Essenes, Morate Zadokites and vanilla Essenes. We don't know. But the scroll here is about a group that reveres the teacher of righteousness, the Morate Zadok. He taught to later generations, so he raised them up a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. He taught to later generations that what God did to the generations deserving of wrath, a company of traitors. They are the ones who depart from the proper way. That is the time which is written, and then we have a quote from Hosea 4:16, like a rebellious cow, so rebelled Israel. That's quoted from Hosea 4:16. Now, the Weisebag and Cook edition has a subtitle for the material that follows that says "The Man of Mockery." This paragraph, which introduces the principal religious opponent of the sect, appears to have been added later. Here's where I take exception to the subheading. I don't think, and the supposition, the theory, that this material was added later. And this is where we get to our first handout. Our first handout, just so you don't have to look it up, it simply says, like a rebellious cow, or a rebellious heifer, a backsliding heifer. And it actually has the full quote from Hosea 4:16. For Israel slides back as a backsliding heifer. Now Yahweh will feed them as a lamb in open country. The word for open country there in the Hebrew indicates a wide open expanse. A pasture basically without definite borders. And what follows in this quote from Hosea 4:16 that only quoted the first half of that, but remember, the ancient Hebrew minds, they knew the scriptures very well. They knew what the rest of it was. They knew what the second half of that verse was. So they knew that it went on to say, Yahweh will feed them as a lamb in open country. Now, you have to also understand that the the Qumran community were hyper um, uh, predestinationalists, hyper fatalists. That becomes very clear in the scrolls. So uh, they ascribe everything to Elohim. Um, so you'll understand what I mean as we continue on with this description, this information about the man of mockery, because we're going to start now getting into um, criticism here that is apparently levied at the Pharisees. When the man of mockery appeared, who sprayed on Israel lying waters, he led them to wander in the trackless wasteland. That's the open country referenced in Hosea 4:16. So in the second half of the verse. So if you know the second half of the verse, you realize that this follows naturally the passage of Hosea 4:16 that was cited. When the man of mockery appeared, who sprayed on Israel lying waters, he led them to wander in the trackless wasteland. Well, but wait a minute. In Hosea 4:16, Yahweh feeds them like a lamb in open country. But remember, even when people are led astray to the hyper predestinationalist mind of these people, it is because it is Elohim's will. Um, he brought down the lofty heights of old, turned aside from paths of righteousness, and shifted the boundary marks that the forefathers had set up to mark their inheritance, so that the curse of his covenant took hold on them. This is where we're now. Remember, we're starting to talk about the Pharisees here. Now, one of the things that Josephus tells us differentiates the Pharisees from the Sadducees is that Josephus tells us that the Pharisees subscribed to traditions that had been handed down by their forefathers, that the Sadducees rejected. We call this the oral law. And as much as some modernists would like to, uh, Connorite revivalists of modern times, would like to have us believe, or would like it to be the case, the Essenes did not reject, the Qumran community didn't reject the oral law. They simply believed the Pharisees had altered it and in a bad way, and had made prohibited things permitted, and moved the boundary marker so that if the oral law prohibited something originally, they believed that the Pharisees had permitted it, and therefore created this wide open, uh, uh, trackless wasteland or open country of Hosea 4:16. From because of this, they were handed over to the sword that avenges the breach of his covenant. That word breach is important. It will become important. The breach of his covenant. For they had sought flattery, choosing travesties of true religion. They looked for ways to break the law. They favored the fine neck. They called the guilty innocent and the innocent guilty. I don't like Weiss, Abegg, and Cook's edition's translation of those lines. Particularly, this is lines, column 1, line 18 uh, through 20. And if you turn to your second handout titled They Sought Smooth Things, you'll see that I provide my own translation of those lines. Line 18, I start with a dot, 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 but I want to start the full thought there. For they sought smooth things. Now they said, why say Bacon Cook, I think says flattery. They sought flattery. And idiomatically, smooth things might refer to flattery. But I think it's important to keep it at literal smooth things because it's going to tie into some important things here. And chose illusions. And they paraphrase this in Weiss, Abegg, and Cook, travesties of true religion. But it's important that it's illusions, and you're going to see why as we continue. Looked for breaches, i.e., loopholes. That's the first word of actually line 19, and the they have ways to break the law. So they paraphrased breaches. Now, I put i.e. loopholes. Okay. Um, it's nice to be able to interpret it, but we'll see why that word breaches is important. And chose the fairest neck. That is an idiomatic way of saying the easiest way. And they justified the wicked and condemned as wicked the righteous. In fact, if you look at this in the Hebrew, it literally says that they made the righteous wicked and the wicked righteous, if you will. They transgressed the covenant and broke the statute. The word there for statute is not Torah, it's huk. So it's not the law, it's the statute. Okay. Why Sabang and Cook don't cite this? I think Theodore Gaster does in his version, but this is actually referencing something from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 30, verses 10 through 13. And we have that here in the handout and underneath that. And you can see the bold faced words that are in parallel. So, verse 10, which say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not to us right things, speak to us smooth things, prophecy illusions. And in the Hebrew, those are the same words as the ones that are being used in this scroll. Get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. Wherefore, thus says the Holy One of Israel, because you despise his word and trust in opposition and perverseness and stay thereon, therefore this iniquity shall be to you as a breach ready to fall, swelling out in a high wall, whose breaking comes suddenly at an instant. Okay. The author of the Damascus Document wants his audience to bring to mind Isaiah chapter 30, verses 10 through 13, and this reference to a high wall. And they're looking for a breach in the wall, they're looking for loopholes, and they're speaking smooth things and illusions. This term smooth things in the Hebrew, this phrase, they seek smooth things. In column 1, line 18, they sought smooth things, is in the Hebrew, darashu b'halakot. And you may notice that that sounds a lot like Midrash Halakot or Midrash Halakha. Midrash Halakot. It is a wordplay apparently aimed at the Pharisees, tying Isaiah chapter 30 in with their verses 10 through 13 in with an attack on the Pharisees and making an attack on their Midrash Halakot. Now, the very first treatments of the oral law as halacha in Pharisaic Judaism, in rabbinic Judaism and prior Pharisaic Judaism really, were not broken down like we have it in the Talmud and the Mishnah under 6 orders and 63 tractates by subject. Instead of breaking them down by subject, the earliest written versions of this material were the early midrashim, and these early midrashim were halachic, not like the later midrashim that we have that are more agadic and narrative in material. And so they are commentaries on books like Shemot, Exodus. They're midrash on them. Now, all of these, even these midrashim that I'm speaking of, post-date this document, but they're oral material. And the implication of this document is that the early vestiges of some of that material actually may have begun um, even at this time, such that there or was oral at this time, but still existed. And so there is this dig at the Pharisees and referring to this passage of Isaiah 30, and they speak to us smooth things, and using the same saying that they sought smooth things, and a wordplay with the phrase midrash halachot. Okay, what's really very exciting is that in Matthew chapter 11, Yeshua is speaking of Yochanan the Immerser. Now, we're going to find out in the study of the Damascus Document and the other scrolls, there's a really strong connection between Yochanan the Immerser and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll find out later in this study that Yochanan was referring to the Pharisees and Sadducees with the same terminology that the Dead Sea Scrolls use, referring to them as, brood of vipers, right? That his own ministry is described as fulfilling Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, make a way for Yahweh in the wilderness, and that the Dead Sea Scrolls use exactly the same passage to describe themselves as the voice crying in the wilderness, just like Yochanan. There's a lot of other material that indicates that Yochanan was an Essene and had actually split off from the Qumran community. So it's very interesting that Yeshua, in describing Yochanan, in referring to Yochanan in Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 through 10, and I'm going to read from the King James Version here, but I just can't say Jesus. I'm going to say Yeshua. As they departed, Yeshua began to say unto the multitude concerning Yochanan, John, what went you out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken with the wind? But what went you out to see? A man clothed in soft raiment, or soft clothing. Behold, they that wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. But what went you out to see? A prophet? Yea, I say to you, and more than a prophet, for this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before my face, which shall prepare the way before you. This phrase, soft clothing, in the Hebrew of the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew, is actually not soft clothing, but smooth clothing, and it's exactly the same word that is used in it's exactly the same word that is used in the Damascus document and in Isaiah 30, verse 10. It's the very same word. In fact, it even has the bait preposition. So it says, clothed in smooth things in the Deutele text. Rather than soft clothing, it says, clothed in smooth things. And the phrase in smooth things is identical to the phrase, in fact, literally you could say that line 18 of the Dead Sea, in the Damascus document says, for they sought in smooth things. It has that same preposition meaning in. Okay. Returning to the Damascus document. And we'll pick up then at line 20. Well, it says they overstepped covenant, violated law, but actually it's not Torah there. It's statute, violated the statute. And they conspired together to kill the innocent. For all those who live pure lives, they loathed from the bottom of their heart. So they persecuted them violently and were happy to see the people quarrel. Because of all of this, God became very angry with their company. He annihilated the lot of them because of all their deeds were uncleanness to him. Uh, this uncleanness word is going to become important in the Dead Sea Scrolls because this was a purity sect. They believed that to be saved, they needed to reach a level of purity, and that the Pharisees had compromised this level of purity. This is what the works of the law were, and we'll find out about it when we get to 4QMMT, which is a document titled Some of the Works of the Law. So now listen to me, all members of the covenant. Members of the covenant, it's important, and it'll become more important as we continue this. So I can make plain to you the ways of the wicked. 4Q 267 adds, so you can leave the paths of sin. That phrase isn't in some of the other documents. God, who loves true knowledge, has positioned wisdom and cleverness in front of him. Cunning and true knowledge wait on him. He is very patient and forgiving, covering the sin of those who repent of wrongdoing. But strength, might, and great wrath, and the flames of fire with all the angels of destruction shall come against all who rebel against the proper way, and who despise the law until they are without merit or survivor, for God has not chosen them from the ancient eternity. Before they were created, he knew what they would do. So he rejected the generations of old and turned away from the land until they were gone. You can see this extreme predestination mindset that the Qumran community had here when if they're not among us, it's because they weren't chosen to be. God didn't choose them from ancient eternity. And why? Because before they were created, he knew that what they would do, so he rejected them. Okay. So God's chosen us and not the Pharisees, because if he had chosen any of them, they'd be among us. Okay. He knows the times of appearance and the number and exact times of everything that has ever existed and ever will exist before it happens in the proper time for all eternity. Well, now the Pharisees would have agreed with that statement, but as we read in Avot 3:16 in the Mishnah, all things are foreknown, but free will is given. The fact that Elohim foreknows things doesn't change our ability to make the choice. And in all of these times, he has arranged that there should be for himself people called by name, so there would always be survivors on the earth replenishing the surface of the earth with their descendants. He taught them through those anointed by the Holy Spirit, the seekers of truth. He explicitly called by name, but whoever he had rejected, he caused to stray. So whoever he rejected, he caused to stray. This is why they understood in column 1, line 13, where they were quoting Hosea 4:16, The other half of 4:16 talks about Elohim basically causing them to Israel, the rebellious calf, to dwell in this large pasture. Um, that's how they associate that with the man of mockery and wander in the trackless wilderness in um, lines uh, 14 and 15 of column 1 that we talked about. Because Elohim, in his sovereignty, allowed it to happen. Therefore, this is a common Hebrew idiom, by the way, in the Tanakh, even. Um, when Elohim in his sovereignty allows something to happen, it's ascribed to him that he did it. Okay. Now we begin a section which Weiss, Abegg, and Cook refer to as the homily on the willful heart. Line 14. So now, my children, listen to me that I may uncover your eyes to see and understand the deeds of God, choosing what pleases him and hating what he rejects, living perfectly in all his ways, not turning away through the thoughts caused by the sinful urge and lecherous eyes. Okay, so the literal Hebrew here is the and in fact we have a very short handout page. Guilty inclination is a much better translation, and it's yitzer is the word for inclination here. It is very similar to the word yitzer hara in concept, the evil inclination that we see in rabbinic Judaism. Okay, and the next phrase is literally eyes of fornication. Okay. For many have gone astray by such thoughts, even strong and daughtry men of old flattered through them and still do. When they went about in their willful heart, the guardian angels of heaven fell and were ensnared by it, for they did not observe the commandments of Elohim, of God. Their sons, who were all tall as timbers, whose bodies were as big as mountains, fell by it. This is referring to the material in the book of Enoch, and that the fallen angels and their offspring, when they copulated with man, who were giants. Everything mortal on dry land expired and became as if they had never existed, because they did their own will and did not keep the commandments of their Maker, until finally his anger was aroused against them, referring obviously to the flood. By it the sons of Noah and their families went astray, and by it they were exterminated. Abraham did not live by it. He didn't live by his willful heart. Um, Now, like all predestinationalists, they're inconsistent in their thoughts because they sort of ascribe some free will to Abraham. Abraham did not live by it and was considered God's friend because he observed the commandments of God and did not choose to, to follow the will of his own spirit. And he passed them on, so he made a choice. Again, like I said, um, all predestinationalists find themselves in inconsistent thinking, and they were no exception. And he passed them on to Isaac and to Jacob, and they too observed them, and they too were recorded as friends of God and eternal partners in the covenant. But the sons of Jacob went astray by them and were punished for their errors. In Egypt, their descendants lived by the willful heart, also, or too obstinate to consult the commandments of God, each one doing what was right in his own eyes. They even ate blood, and the men were exterminated in the wilderness. God commanded them at Kadesh, go up and possess the land, and they chose to follow the will of their spirit and they did not listen to the Maker's voice or the commandments of their teacher. Instead, they grumbled in their tents, so God became angry with their company. Their sons perished because of it. Their kings were exterminated because of it. Their heroes perished because of it. Their land was devastated because of it, and because of it, the members of the forefathers' covenant committed sin, and so were handed over to the sword because they abandoned the covenant of God and chose their own will and followed their own willful heart, each man doing his own will. But when those of them who were left held firm to the commandments of God, he instituted his covenant with Israel. This is very important. Now we're getting to the origins of the sect, the origins of this group. But when those of them who were left held firm to the commandments of God, he instituted his covenant with Israel forever, revealing to them things hidden in which all Israel had gone astray, his holy Sabbaths, his glorious festivals, his righteous laws, his reliable ways. The desires of his will, which man would carry out and so have life in them, he opened up to them so that they dug a well yielding much water. Those who reject his water, he will not allow to live. And although they had wallowed in the sin of humanity and in impure ways, he said, surely this is our business. God, in his mysterious ways, atoned for their iniquity and forgave their transgressions. So he built for them a faithful house in Israel, like none that had ever appeared before, and even at this day, those who hold firm to it shall receive everlasting life. And all human honor is rightly theirs, as God promised them by Ezekiel the prophet, saying, the priests and the Levites and the sons of Zadok, who have kept the course of my sanctuary, when the children of Israel strayed from me, they will bring me fat and blood. Now, this is actually quoting Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 15. This is also where we get the idea of the Zadokite document, the idea that they were Zadokites. But if we read this carefully, it appears that that God promised them by Ezekiel that they are like Zadok, the priests and Levites and the sons of Zadok who have kept the courses of my sanctuary. Um, so this is the sense that they are Zadokites, if you will. They're like Zadok, and the priests, they are the captives of Israel who go out of the land of Judah, and the Levites are those accompanying them, and the sons of Zadok, they are the chosen of Israel, the ones called by name, who are to appear in the last days. So they give here their interpretation of Ezekiel 44:15, and so the Zadokites here, or the B'nai Zadok, the sons of Zadok here, are quote the chosen of Israel, the ones called by name, who are to appear in the last days. Their sect, but they're allegorical Zadokites. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have Zadokites, literal Zadokites among them. This is the full list of their names by their generation and their time. They appeared, the number of their troubles, and the year of their sojourn, and the full list of their deeds. Okay, so now in this next section begins to the subtitle "Why Say Bake and Cook?" Give it says the section that now begins explains the present age is under the power of Belial, that is Satan. Part of the beginning has been lost. So there's some dots here. Holiness whom God atoned for acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, as well as all who came after them, who act according to the interpretations of the law by which the forefathers were taught, until the age is over, that is, the present time. Like the covenant God made with the forefathers to atone for their sin, so shall God atone for them when the total years of this present age are complete. There will be no further need to be connected to the house of Judah, but instead, each will stand on his own tower and will be built the boundary, the wall is built, the boundary removed. Micah 7:11. But in the present age, Belial is unrestrained in Israel, just as God said by Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, saying, Fear and pit and snare are upon you, dweller in the land. Isaiah 24:17. So Isaiah 24:17 now becomes the opening for this reference to fear, pit, and snare to a homily, if you will, on the three traps of Belial. There's a subheading here, Why Say, Beg, and Cook Give, the three traps of Belial. This section explaining the text just quoted discloses some important ethical principles of the Qumran group that in the members' eyes differentiated them from other groups. Their opposition to polygamy, to the uh, amassing of wealth, to defiling the temple of Jerusalem, and to marriage between uncles and nieces. And we now have our next handout, the three traps of Belial. The true meaning of this verse concerns three traps of Belial, about which Levi, son of Jacob, said that Belial would catch Israel in. So he directed them towards three kinds of righteousness. The first is fornication, the second is wealth, and the third is the defiling of the sanctuary. So there's three general categories that the Essenes here had a objection to the overall general culture teachings of the majority, the Pharisees, and also to a lesser to an extent the Sadducees, but really the Pharisees is what they're hitting at here. The first is fornication, the second is wealth, the third is the defiling of the sanctuary. Who escapes from one is caught in the next, and whoever escapes from that is caught in the other. The shoddy wall builders, this is what they're referring to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees had a precept of um, build a wall or a hedge around the Torah. And this principle, build a hedge around the Torah amongst the Pharisees, basically meant that if the Torah said, be in by 11, or let's say be in by midnight, they would have a halacha that said be in by 11. That way, even if you were late and you violated the halacha, you still hadn't violated the actual Torah. This was the principle of building a hedge around the Torah. Yeshua did the same thing. Yeshua said, the Torah says not to murder, don't even be angry. There's a whole series of places where Yeshua placed a hedge around the Torah. And by the way, the Essenes didn't object to this idea of having a hedge around the Torah. Their objection to the Pharisees is that their hedge was shoddy. It was a poorly constructed wall. It had breaches, loopholes that they wanted to be there, and the loopholes allowed them to get around. Okay. The shoddy wall builders who went after precept. Precept is a raver, of whom it says, they shall surely rave. Micah 2:6. They are caught in two traps: fornication, by taking two wives in their lifetime, although the principle of creation is male and female, he created them. Genesis 1:27. Column 5 begins here. And those who went into the ark went into the ark two by two, Genesis 7:9. Concerning the leader, it is written, he shall not multiply wives to himself, Deuteronomy 17:17. But David was not read the sealed book of the law in the ark. It was not opened in Israel from the day of the death of Eleazar and Joshua and the elders who served the goddess Ashereth. It lay buried and was not revealed until the appearance of Zadok. Nevertheless, the deeds of David were all excellent except the murder of Uriah, and God forgave him for that. So this brings us to our first section here in the Three Traps of Belial handout. It's actually titled Three Traps of Belial, Yesod Habriah. And to re-quote our section here of the Damascus Document, they are caught in ... fornication by taking two wives in their lifetime, although the principle of creation, and that phrase, principle of creation, is Yesod, principle, foundation, Habriah, of creation, is male and female. He created them, Genesis 1:27. And those who entered the ark went into the ark two by two, Genesis 7:9. Concerning the leaders, it is written out literally. Actually, this passage of Torah, Deuteronomy 17:17, doesn't say leaders, it says the king. Talking about the king, he shall not multiply wives to himself, Deuteronomy 17:17. But the Qumran sect made a inference. They built a hedge around the Torah, and they generalized this not just to the king, but to leaders in general. The parallel here with the teaching of Yeshua in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, is striking. And the Pharisees approached him and tempted him, saying, is it right for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made man, man in the beginning made him male and female, Genesis 1:27, and said, wherefore shall a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, Genesis 2:24. Notice Genesis 1:27 is the same passage the Damascus document gave. And now then, they are no more two, but one flesh only. What therefore Elohim has joined together, man cannot separate. But they said, why then did Moshe then command to give a bill of divorcement and put her away if she was not pleasing in his sight? Deuteronomy 24:1 and 3. And he answered them and said, because Moshe, on account of the hardness of your hearts, allowed you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I tell you, every man that is put away or shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and takes another, commits adultery. And whoever takes the divorced also commits adultery. Okay, this is a famous dispute that took place between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. And the Essenes come down on the side uh, of Hillel. And oddly enough, Shammai. And oddly enough, in this case, Yeshua comes down on the side of Shammai, although he usually tends to side with Hillel and the general philosophy of Hillel. But in this case, there is a dispute recorded in the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin. I go over this in detail in my Talmud three-part introduction to the Talmud videos. This is one of the disputes in the Talmud I actually go into in great detail. But this is not a study on the Talmud, so we're not going to go into all of that here. The very important here, though, is the parallel here between what Yeshua says and what the Damascus document says on this issue of fornication by taking two wives in their lifetime. Now, taking more than two wives in their lifetime. Um, Somehow I have two wives here in the handout, but it's more than two wives. Okay. And also, uh, the Damascus document ascribes its reasoning to the principle of creation, Yesod HaBriah, and by parallel in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, Yeshua ascribes his reasoning is, but from the beginning it was not so. Now, both passages can be used both against polygamy, which was the primary point of the Damascus document, and against um, pointless divorce or groundless divorce, which is the point in Matthew chapter 19. But Matthew chapter 19 can also be applied to polygamy because it emphasizes that two become one. And the Damascus document is talking, and also when we understand it in light of the historical principle, the cultural historical principle of the Damascus document, because they are so parallel, and the Damascus document is basically saying that by divorcing and remarrying, since the divorces weren't valid, um, uh, that the Pharisees were then engaging in polygamy because when they married the next wife, they were still married to the first one. So they were backdoor polygamy, basically. So that groundless divorce is polygamy, according to the Damascus document. Okay, and so and the parallel between what Matthew says, what Yeshua says in Matthew 19, and what the Damascus document says is just so extremely strong. Then the Qumran community goes on to say that, talking about the leaders, he shall not multiply wives to himself. They apply uh, Deuteronomy 17:17, which is talking about kings, to any leader. And likewise, in 1 Timothy 3:2, Paul applies that rule. He doesn't cite Deuteronomy 17:17, but he says that a bishop in the King James Version, an elder, must be the husband of one wife. And that is another way of saying he shall not multiply wives to himself. So the connection between what the Damascus document says here and what Yeshua and Paul are saying is undeniable. Um, Also, it's important to realize that the Yesod HaBriah, the principle of creation, is the same thing as what Philo of Alexandria calls natural law. Um, so uh, there's also a parallel there with the thinking of Philo of Alexandria and the idea of natural law. By the way, in a blog I wrote, material I wrote on the Nazarene Judaism, the Nazarene Space.com/blog, I have written an analysis of Yeshua's halakha that goes in detail into this application of Yesod HaBriah and the connection with the Damascus document. Then we go on back to the Damascus document here. It says, they also defile the sanctuary, for they do not separate clean from unclean according to the law. I'm going to pause there. 4QMMT is all about that. That's another Dead Sea Scroll that we will look at that basically blames the Pharisees for polluting the temple by not keeping purity regulations enough. And these purity regulations, they believe, would make one righteous, and they referred to as Maaseh HaTorah, the works of the law, which is what Paul is addressing when he talks about works of the law. But we'll all talk about that when we get to 4QMMT. Here, the example given is and lie with a woman during her menstrual period. Um, so obviously Pharisees don't do that, but they apparently uh, they had Essenes had a longer Nadah. Furthermore, they marry each man the daughter of his brothers and the daughter of his sister, although Moses said, unto the daughter of your mother you shall not draw near, she is the flesh of your mother. But the law of consanguinity is written for males and females alike. So if the brother's daughter uncovers the nakedness of the brother of her father, she is the flesh of her father. So they have a halakhic disagreement here with the Pharisees. The Pharisees said that in the Babylonian Talmud, we have a handout on this: marriage to a sister's marriage to a sister's daughter. The Pharisees permitted this, according to because the Torah didn't specifically prohibit it. Concerning him who marries his sister's daughter, um, Babylonian Talmud Yevamot 62b through 63a, if you want to go look it up and study it, um, permits that kind of a marriage based on the fact that the Torah doesn't specifically prohibit it. But the Qumran community said, no, they're wrong. Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, in a very literal sense. That even though both sexes aren't mentioned here, the Torah, Leviticus 18:13, applies to the marriage of an uncle to a niece as much as it does of an aunt to a nephew. Okay. Back to the Damascus document. They defile, okay. Also, they have corrupted their Holy Spirit and have, with blasphemous language. Now, notice it went from 3 traps to 2 traps, and no example of wealth is given. Although, it's very interesting that Yeshua did say some negative things about wealth. They have corrupted their Holy Spirit, and with blasphemous language, they have reviled the statutes of God's covenant, saying they are not well founded. They continually speak abhorrent things against them. Remember, he's talking about the Pharisees. They continually speak abhorrent things against them. All of them are kindlers and lighters of brands. Isaiah 50:11. The webs of a spider are their webs. The eggs of vipers are their eggs. Isaiah 59:5. Whoever touches them shall not be clean. The more he does so, the more he is guilty, unless he is forced. And this is our last handout for today's study. Eggs of vipers. When Yohanan called the Pharisees and Sadducees that came to be immersed, he called them what? Generation of vipers, i.e., eggs of vipers. That's Matthew chapter 3, verse 7, and Luke 3:7. And he was simply having his Essene background. He was employing the Essene terminology for Pharisees because are the wall builders. Later, Yeshua evoked the same language in reference to Pharisees in Matthew 12:34 and 23:33. And I also have down here, and we'll cover it more when we get to it, that as the Essenes called Pharisees whitewashers, in column 8, which we haven't gotten to, line 12. Similarly, Yeshua called certain Pharisees whitened sepulchres, and Paul called Ananias a whited wall. Okay. So we already see a lot of parallels here between what Yeshua and Yochanan the Immerser said and the Damascus document. Now, I want to give you a caution here. We're going to stop here, and we'll pick back up at this point in the Damascus document in our next study. But I do want to caution you, don't draw too many conclusions from the parallels. By the time we finish the Damascus document, you'll find that there were some things that Yeshua specifically called out that that are in the Damascus document that he opposed. There, just because he agreed in finding error with the Pharisees, um, does not mean that he agreed hook, line, and sinker with everything that the Essenes had to say. And in fact, he absolutely did not. And in fact, much of his halakhic material, excuse me, especially on some things like the Sabbath, are very much more like what the Pharisees had to teach on that subject than what the Qumran community had to teach on the same subject. So don't go off the deep end and think because we see these parallels and these similarities that Yeshua was simply an Essene. He wasn't. The original followers of Yeshua were, I refer to as an unlikely union of Essenes and Pharisees. All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and close. I want to remind everybody to please donate to support this work. You can do that by going to um, by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. And I'll also put the link to donate at the end of this video. I'm sorry, in the video description. Um, these teachings are free. They are paid for by those of you that want to see them continue, and those of you that want to support the fact that we are putting this kind of free teaching material online. So please donate to support this work. All right. Shalom, shalom, everybody. And we'll see you next time as we continue this study. And we're also going to be doing some more teaching soon on some other documents and materials as well. Shalom.